Welcome to this webcast. Interested in getting some views from some industry experts across the world. So we've got Margaret Balfour from Australia. She's a prominent consultant in food safety over there. So Margaret will introduce herself in a second. And then we've got John Keogh, who is a prominent expert in transparency and trust and digital technologies, GS1 and so on. He'll introduce himself in a second. Myself, James Flynn. I'm a food safety software expert in food safety and quality management, mainly in the UK and the USA. So this webcast is designed to highlight some of the issues in the global food supply chain around allergen management, and we're going to discuss some of the big issues. To kick that off, I'm going to go over to John and ask John to outline in a couple of minutes just what the big allergen issues he sees from his perspective, and then we'll go to Margaret. So over to you, John.
Thanks, James, and hi, Margaret. It's great to be connected from Scotland to Vietnam to Australia to share some insights. So I think from my perspective, when I look at the global supply chain, it's becoming more and more complex, where we have issues of borders, cultures, languages, regulations, and technologies, but still we have a problem of data fragmentation and a lack of interoperability in supply chains. This means that we have an information asymmetry or a gap in our information and understanding between trading partners right out to consumers. So we need to expose our product information more clearly and more accurately out to consumers so they can make a better and more informed choice. And I think that's the fundamental issue we have. And one of the best definitions of transparency from Professor Geert Jan Hofstede in Holland talks about when everyone in the supply chain has a shared understanding of and access to product-related information that they request without loss, noise, delay, or distortion. And I think therein lies the problem. A shared understanding, we're missing that, and access to information. So the information may be available, but you may not be able to access it, and without loss, noise, delay, or distortion. I think that's fundamentally the issue we have, James.
Yep, perfect. Great sum up. Margaret, what are your views on the state of the global situation on allergens?
Thanks, James, and hi. Yeah. Look, I think that the complexity in the global supply chain for food is ever increasing. The number of allergens, for example, across the globe and from country to country, region to region is also changing. This is a very rapid moving target that we're trying to chase. It's becoming increasingly complex, and the manufacturing facilities are also becoming increasingly complex with the different types of products that they're manufacturing. So the problem is only increasing in complexity, but our knowledge or level of competency or understanding with the management of allergens has not kept up or is not keeping pace with the complexity of the issue. There is an ever-widening gap, I think, of the level of understanding. And to John's point, knowledge is power. We can't provide the information to the consumer if we don't know it ourselves. And I still think the food industry globally has a long way to go in terms of developing and understanding their knowledge of allergens and how they affect our consumers and how they affect our manufacturing processes.
Yeah, and I think, what we're seeing with the advent of digital ledger technology and blockchain technology is a lot of people excited by the prospect of how we can use this technology, but very few people actually understanding how to use it or even whether it's appropriate in some cases for certain solutions. So in the US, for example, you've got Walmart and Dole Foods and others getting on board to track things through the supply chain for very real reasons around things like the E. coli outbreak in romaine lettuce and so on, other issues around salmonella. And we're seeing these things all over the place. What I'm kind of interested in when you're looking at adopting a new technology, going for like the big bang can be a big problem for especially small and medium-sized businesses, which make up 80% of the ecosystem. So, how do you get those guys involved in things like allergen management, traceability, and so on, when many of them don't even have good technology systems in the first place? But if I was to nail you guys down, coming to John first, what do you see as the big problems? What would be the top 2 or 3 problems in the way that you see the food sector handles allergen management at the moment?
Well, I think you go back to the 2 key issues that I see is transparency and trust. And if I look at what happens in the supply chain, we do have bad actors in the supply chain, and we have to accept that. So transparency and trust, from my perspective, has two big enemies. The first one is bad character, and the second one is bad data. It's impossible to eliminate bad character. We have bad actors in the supply chain. And I read the Lockton report in the UK, and it was, almost, I think it was 32% of manufacturers said they cannot trust and cannot authenticate the ingredients that they're getting into their supply chain. That's scary when things like that are happening. So I think there's opportunities as the supply chain is larger. We have more and more opportunity for bad character to come into the supply chain, where products that are not what they should be are getting in. The second one is the bad data, and it's if we use standards. And I think they're the two key issues that we have today. Bad character, bad data. Impossible to eliminate bad character, but we have to watch out for it. Science, analytical science is our best friend. And on the bad data, we have standards like GS1, ISO standards that can help us.
Okay. And Margaret, what do you think the real big problems are? If there was 2 or 3 things that could wave a magic wand and solve, what would those problems be?
I think the first one would be to increase everybody's level of understanding of allergens, how they occur in the industries, cross-contamination risk, et cetera, and that's only going to happen with education. The second issue is, I think, industry understanding the complexity of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis and how that increases their risk, and therefore being able to recognise that the opportunity for undeclared allergens and a recall in their product is actually a lot higher than people, I think, in industry generally recognise it is. And I think the statistics for recall across the globe, and obviously certainly in our region, is bearing that out in terms of looking at the data and the frequency of recalls we're now having for undeclared allergens, because clearly all the standards that we have, and don't get me wrong, John, the standards are valuable, they are a great tool to use, but they're not a panacea for the problem. They're not going to solve the problem on their own. There's many aspects that we have to put together to make this work. And I think clearly, even GFSI standards, retailer standards, they're not working because the statistics are now showing us that we've got a significant increase in the number of recalls due to undeclared allergens in food products.
So it's interesting, that one, because in one respect, you could argue that standards are working because we're finding more problems, because the standards are making people look for more problems. However, I kind of think that if you're relying on a once a year GFSI audit to validate that food safety and allergen control and so on is being complied with, then that's a tall order, because the default behavior of people and human nature is to, well, we've got a big inspection, we better spruce things up and check the data and make sure everything's good, because they know the audit's coming. Now, BRC issue 8 has got new options in there for doing 4 audits per year, which I think is a step in the right direction. So it's much more about looking at the performance of food safety and allergen management, for example, across the year, rather than just on 1 or 2 days when the audit happens. And I think we need to see more of that kind of thing from GFSI and from other standard owners, to have more of a kind of a spread view on how effective systems are. But there's no doubt in my mind that as things like detection technology, test and analysis technology get better, it's easier to test and find, and the cost of these things has, I think, come down significantly over the last 10 or 15 years. So they can do more testing, and retailers do a lot of testing.
I think the other thing, James, it's of value to understand in that space is that, yes, 1 audit per year is not going to give a great deal of confidence in the business, but certainly things like food safety culture development programs within the business itself should help emphasise those areas that need attention. And I really am pleased to see that some of the GFSI standards, such as BRC, are now actually not having it as an additional voluntary module. Food safety culture is now a mandatory requirement in the standard, because let's face it, if you don't have a good food safety culture in your business, you're not going to have safe food.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of good and bad practice within the manufacturing side of things, what examples would you see, Margaret, coming to you on this one, of good and bad practice in terms of allergen management?
There's a plethora of examples out there, and I think that there are some voluntary tools that can be used that are science-based. They're very thorough and they're very accurate. The Vital tool that's available in Australia, for example, is an excellent tool for people to train their staff understand and delve further into their processes and understand hang-up points in their operation, validation and verification of cleaning programs for allergen residuals. It even teaches them about the different methods that you can use to assess both your finished product and swabs taken in production areas, and teaches strengths and weaknesses of the different technologies that are available. So we need to be getting down to that level. Now, that's a voluntary tool. One of the major retailers in Australia used to have it as a mandatory requirement in their supply to that retail chain. That's been removed as a mandatory requirement, but that's an example of something that the industry can use that's a really positive tool that I think is what I consider to be best practice if it's appropriately implemented.
Yep. Excellent. And John, from a transparency and trust point of view, what are you seeing in that whole digital space with your work with Alexa Origin Trail and your previous work with GS1? What good and bad practices have you seen in that area?
Well, first I want to agree with Margaret. I've been a strong supporter of food safety culture for many years, and I think that's absolutely critical. When nobody's looking, you need to be doing the right thing, and this is part of the problem in many countries. I see it here in Vietnam as well, and I hear it from auditors. They may spend a week at a plant, they go away for lunch, and they come back, and the bad practices are in place again. Yeah. So I think it's absolutely critical, and you cannot do that overnight. That's a cultural change just to get people to think differently.
And it comes from the top, right, John? That culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. It has, absolutely, but it needs to be understood by the people at the bottom level. So, for example, in a country like Vietnam, not to pick on Vietnam, but 75% of workers are unskilled labor. Yep. So you're talking about education, the basic level of education, and bringing it up. The problem is that these people are going to be replaced by robots and 4.0. So this is a big challenge for countries like Vietnam. Is how do you get the unskilled workers educated so they can comply with the bare minimum of food safety practices worldwide and be transparent? On the transparency and trust side, we see a lot of good things happening. I'm concerned about some of the terminology that's used out there, like radical transparency. And I think that's just more sensationalism. I think we have to get simple transparency right first. Yep. Before we start talking about radical transparency. I don't even know what that is, and I'm a transparency scholar. At the end of the day, going back to the point I was talking about earlier with transparency and trust has two main enemies with bad character and bad data. Yeah. I think Margaret didn't agree with the standards, but what I meant, Margaret, on the standards is the standards for data and information, not the food safety standards per se. And I would agree with you that they're not working. If I was addressing, let's say, 1,000 CEOs from the food industry, I would tell them with passion, and not with arrogance, but with passion, that not one of them has accurate data within their companies. And I guarantee them that. It starts and finishes with the data. You're going to have multiple departments and functions that have their own copy of the data. And I think from a data governance perspective, this is where they need to go back to the GS1 organization, which look at the best practices for managing data and try to implement that within their organizations. And I think that's where it starts, is proper data governance strategies. And when you look at data governance, you have to break it down into who is the authoritative source for the data. A simple example, if I have one product with 100 attributes, the brand owner may be only responsible for creating 75 of those attributes. And there may be 4 external organizations, including someone that verifies the allergens, that may be the authoritative source or the creator of those attributes and the owner of those attributes. So that if that's not well understood, what's happening is the brand owner can be pushing products out to the market and misaligned with the attribute owners in different organizations. Let's say it's a halal certification, and this is part of the problem. We don't understand in the big organizations and small organizations how to do data governance properly and the critical impact it has. And I'll just finish on this one. As Margaret pointed out, the risk is absolutely huge, and I don't think companies understand risk management and the risk that their business runs when they do put a product out to the market. There's a financial risk, and there's also the legal liability. Yeah. Yeah. We've seen these cases around the world where people are dying from eating products with an allergen that's undeclared. I mean, I think that's unacceptable.
Yeah. Onto that subject of risk, my own feeling about that is that there are very, very few people in the food industry that really know how to do risk analyses properly. And what do I mean by that? 99% of the food industry uses risk matrices, and most of those risk matrices are 3x3, 3x4 risk matrices that they've copied from somewhere else. They're using them blindly without actually having the competency and the training to understand how to do a risk assessment. And secondly, referring to the scientific data around things like probability of occurrence and backing that up with real data from industry. So, I mean, how many people really do those kind of searches to find out how frequent cross-contamination is between various allergens for a particular product in a certain area, for example. And then there's other aspects of risk. BRC issue 8, for example, mentioned the term risk assess 27 times. What we see in the food industry globally is that industry is really drowning under a sea of risk assessments where they are literally got hundreds and hundreds of risk points that they're looking at without really understanding it. That gives a real management problem, a real compliance and overhead problem to food companies, whereby if you've got that many things to manage, you're never going to be able to manage them all. So you're going to need ways to prioritize. And therefore, there's a couple of aspects to risk assessment which really need to be brought into the vocabulary. And that is volatility. How often does a risk change, for example, and backing that up with data. And then also confidence in the risk assessment itself. How confident are we in a given risk assessment, be it an allergen or a food safety risk assessment? Because if we're not very confident in it, then we really need to get some expert help, because what we've measured means nothing if we don't have good, verifiable confidence in a risk assessment. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, Margaret, from your experience of reviewing what others are doing on risk, etc.
Look, I absolutely agree with you, James. I think that risk assessment, whilst it permeates every food safety program, every quality management system, I don't necessarily think that many of the people that are doing the risk assessments have had any formal training and therefore could not necessarily demonstrate competency. Australia is a little unique in that we do have an Australian standard for risk assessment. It uses a 5x5 matrix methodology. I think that, however, gives the industry maybe a false sense of confidence as to their ability to meet due diligence requirements and risk assessments simply because they've used the Australian standard. The ability and the data to apply and make an appropriate risk assessment, to your point, is about how often do things change and what's happening in the matrix. The other key thing in the food industry is how aware are people of what's happening around the globe. Yeah. We had an issue last year in Australia. There were a series of recalls for listeria in frozen vegetables. I'm sure you're both very well aware of this.
Yep.
And it was only through, for example, the Horizon Scan tool that we became aware that this was becoming a trend, hadn't even hit our shores. And then within a very short period of time, our major retailers had national recalls here for frozen vegetables with listeria. So the risk assessment is one thing, but the changing scenery that sets the data for that risk assessment is something that you need to be on top of. And I don't think industry necessarily does that very well either.
Okay, so coming on to our final point so that we bring to some sort of conclusions here and so on. I would like to talk for a moment about digital ledger technology and blockchain and where that's at the moment and how we see that evolving. So coming to you, John, I know you're heavily involved in this space. How do you see, specifically to do with allergens, but maybe a little bit wider as well, how do you see digital ledger and blockchain technology helping to improve this to the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. The fundamental problem we have, and it's been driven by, I think, regulation. I don't think anyone would disagree with this part. We have in regulation the one up, one down traceability. So when we have that, the incentive for industry to go beyond that is not necessarily there because it costs money and it reduces margins. So the problem we have across the industry today, if we look at the length of a supply chain, we have data fragmentation. So what blockchain can do is actually can help us to put in a middleware layer where certain aspects of the data can flow from party to party. This is what we're doing at Origin Trail by putting in that independent neutral layer of data or to manage the data between the trading partners. So blockchain will actually help us mitigate the risk that current regulations are posing for us. The problem with all of this is that blockchain is not a silver bullet. However, it will give us transaction trust over time. Now, the issue here is the data that goes in needs to be curated in some way, shape, or form. So the more we look at a process, I'm very process-oriented, as I believe both of you are. If we look at the key processes within a supply chain, right down to a very detailed level, we can identify risk in the supply chain and look at where is there a human interaction where there could be risk, and how can we automate that with an IoT device or a temperature sensor or something like that. These, I think, are key and important components. If we look to the future, we have to see blockchain as foundational and not disruptive. I mean, I really, honestly, I don't like seeing the word disruptive and blockchain in the same sentence. In 5 years' time, I don't think we'll be talking about blockchain because it's going to be a fundamental component of how companies operate. And I think what's going to happen from moving forward is a lot of the incumbent ERP players and solution providers will start to enable blockchain-like transparency and trust in their platforms.
Yeah.
It is going to take time to implement, but it will have unprecedented changes in the supply chain. So I think the key part is overcoming the one up, one down. It's overcoming the data stovepipes that we have, putting in an interoperability layer. And the other key component is that a blockchain solution like Origin Trail, which currently is a not-for-profit platform and it's open source, it's also based on GS1 standards, which means you have the interoperability between the trading partners. And you can connect blockchain to another blockchain or a blockchain to a legacy app. So there's a lot of organizations looking at it and reviewing it, and several of them are using it right now. I think it's a good way to go, and it aligns pretty nicely with GS1.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thanks for that, John. And Margaret, what's your take on blockchain and the way industry sees it and how you think it might be used to improve the situation, or indeed if it can improve the situation?
Look, I think it can. I know in the public arena, I like to have a dig at blockchain on a regular basis, but what I'm really having a dig at is the people that are making claims about blockchain, about all these wonderful things it can do. You know, it's going to make my dinner and it's going to do this and it's going to do that. And the reality is it can and it cannot and it never will do a lot of the things that people are claiming that it can do. What it will do, though, is, to your point, John, is provide us with a greater level of transparency. If the data in there is accurate and is well managed, to your point, it's going to give us a much faster and a much more rapid and accurate response when we do have an issue. That's what I see as probably the biggest benefit to any of these digital ledger technologies, where you've got this shared data across a multitude of people within the chain or businesses within the chain, and we get a much more rapid response when we do have an issue. That's what I see as the key benefit out of this technology.
Yeah, there's a lot happening on blockchain, and some of it is very big in scale in terms of Walmart wanting to manage its entire supply chain and so on. What I'm really seeing from a software developer's point of view, who is also a food safety consultant, as the opportunity is kind of like, with mobile phones. When the first smartphone came along, it was seen as disruptive because it was different. But really, what it was a computing application or computing platform that allowed us to get apps. The smartphone is not really a smartphone. Let's face it. It's a computer in your pocket, and it's got apps on there. And each of these apps are small, discrete applications that perform a specific function. You can book a flight on it. You can book a restaurant on there. You can go find out some information about something and message your friends and so on. I'm kind of seeing what blockchain is blockchain is the ecosystem behind a new breed of transparency and data sharing apps. Coming back to the allergen side of things, and this is something we've been doing some work on, we've been building a proof of concept on a digital ledger technology called IOTA, and that application is really looking at allergens that come through, for example, through our Verify system, and that information can then be shared onto a digital ledger. The big benefit I see is that the consumer can then scan the barcode, which needs GS1 standards, as John spoke about earlier on there. You've got the barcode, GS1 standards that link all that stuff together and get verified data from the manufacturer of that product about what the allergens are that are in that product. And I think that's a simple but effective way to use digital ledger technology to help with one aspect of the allergen control. But it needs good food safety culture. It needs good systems in place to be able to share information. And I think blockchain and digital ledger have quite a big part to play in that in the future, because there are too many systems out there that just don't talk to each other, and digital ledgers have a good opportunity to connect them all together in a standardized fashion. But as John says, it does need standards.
Can I add to that just a small addition to it? I think as we move forward, if I go back to the example I used earlier of 100 attributes on a product, 75 of them are generated and the authoritative source is the brand owner. I think in your scenario where the consumer scans the barcode, that instead of getting all of the data from the brand owner, it goes out to maybe 5 sources who are the authoritative source for the inquiry. So if it's a halal certification, it's actually unknown to the consumer, but it's actually shooting into the Halal Association of the UK or Australia and verifying that that's a valid attribute, that's correct. Or if it's, we know there's a lot of fake USDA organic, and the USDA organic are actually publishing a list of fake USDA organic certifications. So if it's USDA organic, it should shoot off to that database and pull back the attribute from the authoritative source. I think if we can get that done architecturally, then we're into a scenario where we reduce the risk of cheating and we increase the integrity of the platform. And then, of course, to your point, we can have the integrity of the certification. So if somebody is saying that this product is allergen free, or here's the allergens guarantee that's in this product, and you're notifying the consumer, that we have traceability not only back to the plant and where it was processed and where the ingredients came from, but to the person that made that decision. Now, therein lies a future risk for privacy and so on and so forth. But if we get down to that level of who signed off on the product, be it for food safety or for allergens, we may identify a process problem, a training problem, or a competency issue with a human. And I think that's important too, that we kind of reframe the picture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we'd like to kind of wrap things up now. I think we've covered quite a lot of interesting issues and some great discussion here. My favorite bit, though, from John was about the combination of robots that are actually making the food and blockchain technology that are actually managing all the data that's done with that. You know, maybe that's the way forward. But I suspect that in the short term, it's probably going to take people like us talking about these issues and discussing it and, getting the message out that the industry needs to have a look at itself and have a look at what it's doing and, try to improve and so on. Any final thoughts from you both before we wind up?
Well, I think I'd like to see GFSI put a stronger focus on best practices around allergens, a definite process focus, and then look at the technologies that can help alleviate the problem. But we have to focus on the process first, and then after that, we can look at which technologies can help solve it.
Excellent. Yeah. And from you, Margaret?
Look, I'll second that, John. I absolutely support your comment, and I think that no matter what technology we end up with down the track, whether it's a label that's going on to a baguette or whether it's information that's available on a blockchain somewhere, the data that goes into the system has to be reliable and it has to be validated. And if the people that are putting the information into the system are not competent, then that information will not be reliable no matter what the technology is.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I'd like to thank you both for your time. Thank you for your valuable expert insights into this topic, and I hope to speak to you guys soon. So thanks a lot and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.